It all began with a simple garden gnome, a small, smiling figurine with a red hat and a chipped nose, standing proudly beside a patch of tulips. To most people, it was harmless, even charming. But to the local homeowners association, it was apparently the beginning of an unspeakable crime. The homeowner, a quiet man named Mark, had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 10 years. He paid his dues, kept his lawn trimmed, and minded his own business. His small front yard was his sanctuary, a modest piece of land he took pride in maintaining. It wasn't flashy, but it had character. Rows of bright flowers, a bird bath, and over time, a growing collection of quirky garden gnomes. At first, the collection was nothing more than a few souvenirs from trips. But as the years went by, Mark's gnomes became his hobby, a source of personal joy and nostalgia. Each one had a story, and each one found its home in his garden. There was the fisherman gnome from his first camping trip after retirement, the firefighter gnome in memory of his father, and even a small, hand-painted one gifted by his granddaughter. It was harmless fun, until the HOA noticed. The first letter came on a Thursday. A thin, neatly folded notice tucked under his front door, printed with the HOA's logo at the top. The words were cold and bureaucratic. A violation of community aesthetic guidelines. They claimed his gnomes were excessive, distracting, and inconsistent with neighborhood uniformity. The letter gave him 7 days to remove them or face a fine of $100 per day. Mark stared at the paper in disbelief. $100 a day? For gnomes? He thought it had to be a mistake, but the HOA wasn't joking. Within a week, a second notice followed, this time stamped with the bold words, "Final warning." Mark walked through his garden that evening, the sun dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the little gnome faces. They looked up at him, cheerful, oblivious, as if they didn't realize they had become public enemies. Something in him hardened. It wasn't about the gnomes anymore. It was about principle. He had always known the HOA could be controlling. Neighbors whispered stories about them fining people for mailboxes being the wrong color or lawns being an inch too long. But this time it was personal. They weren't just telling him what to do. They were trying to erase something he loved. Mark decided not to take them down. And that's when the real trouble began. The fines started rolling in like clockwork, $100 a day, every day, accumulating faster than he could count. The HOA board sent photos of his yard as evidence, taken from the street, sometimes even at night. They called his decorations visual clutter. One even accused him of lowering property values. Neighbors began to take sides. Some thought the HOA was being ridiculous. Others muttered about rules being rules. A few simply avoided eye contact, afraid to be caught in the crossfire. Mark didn't respond. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply kept tending to his garden, planting new flowers, cleaning the bird bath, and occasionally adding one more gnome. By the time the HOA's third warning arrived, there were over 30 of them. They stood in rows, hidden among tulips and bushes, peeking from behind the mailbox and under the trees. Each one different, each one defiant. The HOA president, a sharp-dressed woman named Carol, decided to make an example out of him. A formal letter was sent threatening legal action if he didn't comply. She claimed his non-conformity was setting a dangerous precedent for the neighborhood. That night, as Mark sat on his porch, watching the lights flicker across his yard, he had a thought. If they wanted to call his gnomes a public nuisance, maybe he'd give them exactly that. Over the next few weeks, something began to change. Delivery trucks started arriving at his home more frequently, not for him, but for boxes labeled with strange names, mystical creatures, whimsical wonderland, garden fantasy. He ordered from artists around the country, custom-made gnomes, each with unique themes and designs. Soon, his modest yard transformed into a colorful, bizarre landscape, a tiny kingdom of fantasy. Some gnomes carried lanterns that glowed at night. Others rode ceramic animals or stood on miniature bridges. A small pond appeared, surrounded by fairy lights and mushroom statues. It wasn't just a garden anymore. It was art, Passers-by began to notice. Cars slowed down to look. Children pointed out of back seats, laughing and shouting in excitement. Parents took photos. Word spread across social media, first local, then regional. Man turns HOA dispute into giant gnome display. Read one viral post. Within days, people were visiting from neighboring towns, parking along the curb just to take pictures. Mark didn't charge a dime. He simply smiled from his porch as strangers admired his crime. The HOA, however, was furious. Carol sent more letters, more threats. She complained about traffic obstruction, unauthorized gatherings, and public disturbance. But every time she tried to escalate, the story only grew bigger. News crews showed up. Local reporters interviewed Mark about his gnome protest. What began as a petty neighborhood feud had now become a public spectacle. Mark didn't plan for fame. He just wanted peace. But watching the crowd of families and photographers admiring what the HOA had called ugly, he realized something. They couldn't stop him anymore. The gnomes had taken on a life of their own. By the end of the month, his once quiet street was now a weekend attraction. Food trucks showed up uninvited. Artists left him hand-painted gnomes as gifts. The HOA's reputation was in shambles, mocked online for their pettiness and overreach. Still, the fines continued. $100 a day, every day. But Mark had a plan forming, a way to turn their greed into their downfall, because if they wanted to treat his yard like a business, then maybe, just maybe, he'd make it one. And with that thought, the real revenge began. The transformation began quietly, almost like a secret experiment. While the HOA thought Mark was drowning under their endless fines, he was actually laying the groundwork for something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. The gnome garden, once a simple act of defiance, was about to evolve into a full-fledged attraction. Mark started small. He began by adding discreet signs at the edge of his property. Nothing flashy. Just wooden boards hand-painted with the words, "The Gnome Sanctuary, free to visit." Within a week, people started stopping more frequently. Parents took family photos, couples posed for selfies, and local artists sketched the whimsical scenery. The small-town buzz grew into a regional fascination. Local bloggers wrote about it. Instagram influencers tagged his address, and soon the trickle of visitors became a steady stream. But Mark wasn't content with just popularity. He wanted sustainability. So he set up a small donation box labeled simply, "Help the Gnomes Grow." To his surprise, people began dropping in bills, coins, and even small notes of encouragement. Within days, the donations surpassed the total amount of HOA fines he had accumulated so far. It was poetic justice. The very gnomes the HOA had called a nuisance were now paying for their own defense. What began as revenge was slowly turning into a source of genuine joy and income. Mark used the money to improve the garden further. He added walking paths lined with pebbles, tiny signs that told each gnome's backstory, and solar-powered lights that illuminated the figures after sunset. The effect was enchanting. At night, the garden shimmered like a fairy tale landscape, attracting families who would sit quietly, watching the glow of tiny ceramic smiles under the stars. Local food trucks began parking near his street on weekends, selling snacks and drinks to the growing crowds. Small businesses benefited, neighbors started renting out their driveways for parking, and suddenly the HOA's attempt to suppress individuality had turned the entire neighborhood into a small economic hub. Of course, Carol, the HOA president, was seething. She couldn't stand it. Her constant emails and complaints to the board were ignored or ridiculed. The community that once followed her every directive was now mocking her for trying to fight something that had clearly brought life and attention to their otherwise dull suburb. She doubled down, citing new violations. She accused Mark of running a business from residential property and encouraging public loitering. But every complaint only brought more visitors. The story was too entertaining for people to ignore. HOA tries to shut down Gnome Garden became a trending headline in local news again, and this time even national outlets picked it up. When reporters showed up with cameras, Mark didn't need to say much. His calm demeanor and the sheer joy on the faces of visiting families spoke louder than any defense he could make. He didn't act like a rebel or a troublemaker. He acted like someone who loved his community, someone celebrating art and creativity. The public was firmly on his side now. The HOA's credibility collapsed under the weight of its own pettiness. Some board members began quietly resigning, not wanting their names associated with the embarrassment. Yet, Carol persisted. She demanded a city inspection, hoping zoning laws would shut him down. But when the inspector arrived, they found no violations. Everything was technically compliant. The visitors weren't being charged. The donation box was voluntary. The decorations were on private property. Mark had been careful. The inspector's final report stated there was no actionable breach of local ordinance. That single sentence crushed Carol's hopes completely. Mark didn't gloat, though he could have. Instead, he expanded. With the support of local artists and volunteers, he built a new section in his yard called Gnome Village. It featured miniature houses, pathways, and even a handmade wooden bridge. He installed a small mailbox labeled Letters to the Gnomes, where children could leave notes. Every Sunday, he'd place small replies inside, written as if from the gnomes themselves. The community loved it. Families came from miles away, and the garden became a symbol of creativity triumphing over control. Local schools brought art classes for field trips. The mayor even mentioned the garden during a city event, calling it a local landmark. Ironically, the same HOA that once prided itself on maintaining neighborhood standards was now known nationwide for trying to destroy a beloved attraction. Mark's revenge was no longer just personal, it was poetic. What made it even sweeter was that the donations kept flowing, enough to cover his legal fees, home maintenance, and even a few upgrades. He installed security cameras, not just for safety, but to record the constant flow of smiling visitors. The footage later became viral content online, further boosting his popularity. He also began collaborating with local craftsmen, allowing them to sell handmade gnomes near his fence under a simple community craft corner setup. Everything was technically off his property, fully legal, and impossible for the HOA to touch. The irony was complete. The HOA's attempt to control him had led to community engagement, business growth, and international recognition. But Mark wasn't finished yet. Deep down, he knew that as long as Carol remained HOA president, she'd never stop trying to destroy what he built. And though he had no desire for open conflict, he also wasn't going to back down. So, as the second month of fines rolled in and the HOA's patience began to wear thin, Mark began preparing for the final phase of his plan. It wasn't about gnomes anymore. It was about accountability. And this time, he wouldn't just embarrass the HOA, he would expose them. The seeds of revenge had been planted, and soon they were going to bloom in full spectacular color. The growing fame of Mark's gnome sanctuary had transformed the once quiet neighborhood into a bustling attraction. But behind the smiling visitors and flashing cameras, tension simmered like an unseen storm. Carol, the HOA president, watched her control slipping away day by day. What was once a pristine, rule-abiding community had become a place of laughter, crowds, and color. Everything she despised. Her front porch, once her throne from which she observed every violation, now overlooked a constant stream of strangers who didn't care about her authority. The sound of children laughing and car doors closing grated on her nerves. She told herself it wasn't jealousy, but deep down that's exactly what it was. Mark's defiance had turned him into a local hero, while she became the face of everything wrong with HOA power. Determined to reclaim her dominance, Carol called an emergency HOA meeting. She rallied what few loyal members remained, painting Mark as a troublemaker who was destroying the neighborhood's character. She presented photos of crowded streets, cars parked along curbs, and visitors walking across lawns, conveniently ignoring that none of it was actually illegal. Still, she crafted her argument with precision, insisting that Mark's property had become a public nuisance and that the board had a duty to restore order. The few members who dared to object were silenced by her sheer force of will. She proposed a motion to escalate matters to legal court, a full civil complaint citing unlawful use of residential property. The board reluctantly approved, more out of exhaustion than agreement. Within a week, Mark received the notice. A thick envelope arrived, heavy with the weight of bureaucratic threat. The HOA was officially suing him for public disturbance, violation of community standards, and unauthorized commercial activity. They demanded not only the removal of the gnomes, but reimbursement of all accumulated fines and legal fees. For any ordinary homeowner, that might have been the breaking point. But Mark wasn't ordinary. By now, he had grown accustomed to the HOA's tactics. He read the complaint calmly, sitting in his backyard as the glow of the garden lights shimmered across the pond. The air was peaceful, the faint laughter of visitors echoing from the street. He knew this was coming, and he was ready. Over the past few weeks, Mark had quietly built a network of support. Reporters, lawyers, local activists, and even a few sympathetic former HOA members had reached out to him. He had evidence. Every letter, every fine, every baseless threat neatly documented and stored. He knew the HOA operated through intimidation, not legality, and this time he intended to show everyone exactly how deep their corruption went. Meanwhile, Carol was confident she had cornered him. She strutted around the neighborhood, boasting to anyone who would listen that the eyesore would soon be gone. Her arrogance blinded her to the changing tide. She didn't see the quiet resentment in her neighbors' faces or the way they turned away when she spoke. Even those who once supported her were beginning to see the truth. The HOA wasn't protecting property values. It was destroying community spirit. The lawsuit only made things worse for the HOA's public image. The news of the legal battle spread quickly. Local journalists framed it as a David versus Goliath story, one man defending creativity against an oppressive board. Interviews poured in, donations skyrocketed, and the Gnome Sanctuary became a national talking point. Television crews camped on the street. Mark's story appeared in newspapers, podcasts, and YouTube videos, all painting him as a kind, quiet man being bullied by a petty institution. Carol, on the other hand, was portrayed as the villain, the ruthless HOA president obsessed with control. Every time she tried to justify the lawsuit publicly, she only dug herself deeper. Her condescending tone and rigid expressions made her the perfect antagonist. Comment sections exploded with outrage, and memes featuring her scowling face spread online like wildfire. Behind the scenes, the HOA's finances were collapsing. The endless legal expenses drained their budget. Members began withholding their dues in protest, refusing to fund what they called Carol's personal vendetta. Vendors who provided maintenance services stopped working for them. The once powerful HOA was bleeding from within, while Mark's garden flourished more than ever. But Carol refused to back down. Pride had consumed her completely. She hired a private investigator to find any technical violation she could use against Mark. Building codes, safety violations, anything. Weeks passed, but the investigator found nothing substantial. Mark's property was meticulously compliant. Every light, every path, every decoration met city regulations. The irony was almost poetic. The man she accused of lawlessness was the only one actually following the law. Frustrated, Carol began crossing lines she couldn't uncross. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, she walked to Mark's yard with a flashlight in hand. Her plan was to gather evidence, maybe take photos suggesting damage or litter, anything to justify further complaints. But what she didn't realize was that Mark's newly installed security cameras saw everything. The footage clearly showed her trespassing, taking pictures, and even knocking over one of the gnomes near the path. The next morning, Mark filed a police report. He didn't make a scene. He didn't even confront her. But when local news outlets got wind of it, the story spread instantly. HOA president caught trespassing on homeowner's property. It was the breaking point. The public turned against her entirely. The HOA board, already crumbling, called an emergency session to vote her out as president. Carol tried to defend herself, claiming she was investigating a violation, but no one believed her anymore. The vote was unanimous. She was removed from her position. Mark didn't celebrate openly, but deep inside, he felt a quiet satisfaction. His garden stood brighter than ever, and his reputation had transformed from local oddity to community hero. Yet even as Carol's downfall made headlines, Mark sensed it wasn't over. The HOA was weakened but not defeated. There were still those who wanted revenge, who saw him as a threat to their control. And while Carol had been humiliated, her bitterness hadn't disappeared. It had only changed shape, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The war between one man's freedom and an institution's pride was far from finished, and the next move would determine everything. The fall of the HOA president should have marked the end of the chaos, but instead, it ignited something far bigger than anyone could have predicted. What began as a neighborhood dispute had now turned into a national fascination. News channels replayed clips of the Gnome Garden day and night, accompanied by upbeat music and headlines that painted Mark as a symbol of rebellion against overreaching authority. Online, the story exploded. Social media feeds were filled with photos, hashtags, and fan art of gnomes holding protest signs that read, "Let us stay," or "Gnome, sweet gnome." Late-night talk shows joked about it, and reporters from around the country came knocking, eager to capture a glimpse of the now famous Gnome Sanctuary. For the first time in years, Mark found himself the center of a phenomenon he never intended to create. He was invited to speak on morning shows, podcasts, and community panels. But while the attention was flattering, it also came with pressure. Strangers lined his street daily, snapping photos, leaving gifts, even asking for autographs. His once quiet life was now filled with noise, attention, and responsibility. He didn't crave fame, but he understood its power. If the HOA had tried to silence him, this attention made it impossible. They couldn't hide behind legal jargon anymore. The world was watching. Yet beneath the laughter and admiration, tension lingered. With Carol gone, the HOA scrambled to rebuild its image. A temporary board was appointed, composed of nervous members trying to clean up the mess. But public opinion had already turned against them. Every action they took was scrutinized. Reporters dug into their financial records, uncovering years of questionable spending, fancy dinners, unnecessary landscaping contracts, and inflated fees paid to board members' relatives. The revelations confirmed what many suspected. The HOA had long been mismanaged and corrupt. Residents who had once feared them began speaking up, sharing stories of arbitrary fines, favoritism, and intimidation. The neighborhood, once ruled by conformity, was now united by frustration. Mark had unknowingly become the catalyst for change. Meanwhile, Carol refused to disappear quietly. Though stripped of her title, she still lived a few houses down, stewing in anger and humiliation. She despised seeing news vans parked in her neighborhood and hearing strangers praise the man she blamed for her downfall. She began leaving anonymous comments online, accusing Mark of exploiting the situation for fame, claiming his tourist attraction had ruined the peace. But her bitterness only fueled more ridicule. The internet, once a passive observer, became a defense force for Mark. Anytime someone insulted the Gnome Garden, an army of supporters flooded the comments with photos, testimonials, and heartfelt stories of how the sanctuary brought joy during hard times. For many, it wasn't just about gnomes. It was about standing up to small-minded power. Local businesses capitalized on the craze. Cafes began selling Gnome Blend coffee. Souvenir shops printed shirts with slogans like Team Gnome, and even the city's tourism board reached out to Mark, offering to list his garden as an official local attraction. He politely declined the commercial offers, preferring to keep it simple, but he couldn't deny that the movement had taken a life of its own. Yet not all attention was positive. With fame came scrutiny. Some critics began questioning whether Mark's peaceful protest had gone too far. They complained about traffic, noise, and overcrowding. A few neighbors who had stayed silent during the feud now started grumbling about the disruption. The line between admiration and irritation was thinning. Mark could feel the pressure mounting. Again, this time not from authority, but from the weight of expectation. He knew the story's charm wouldn't last forever. Public fascination was fickle, and in the background, the HOA's remaining members were quietly regrouping. They had learned from Carol's mistakes. Instead of attacking Mark directly, They started planning subtle strategies to regain control of the neighborhood's narrative. They began holding community improvement meetings, presenting themselves as victims of a misunderstanding. They framed the media attention as harmful to the neighborhood's reputation, arguing that outsiders were disrupting their safety. They couldn't find Mark anymore, not after the backlash, but they began drafting new policies, quietly, carefully, aimed at restricting gatherings, decorations, and non-essential outdoor structures. Mark soon caught wind of these new rules through a friend on the inside. The HOA wasn't finished. They were just getting smarter. They wanted to rebuild their authority piece by piece until they could strike again legally. But this time, Mark wasn't alone. His supporters extended far beyond the neighborhood. Lawyers offered free representation, journalists monitored HOA meetings, and residents recorded every attempt at manipulation. The HOA couldn't move without being exposed. Still, they persisted. Anonymous letters began appearing in Mark's mailbox again. Unsigned complaints about noise, trash, and unsanitary conditions. It was the same pattern as before, only this time, hidden behind a mask of civility. The stress began to weigh on him. The garden that once brought peace now required constant maintenance, and the endless visitors left footprints across his lawn. He felt torn between gratitude and exhaustion. He had never wanted to be a public figure, just a man tending his garden. But stepping back wasn't an option anymore. The HOA was waiting for any sign of weakness, and somewhere in the shadows, Carol was still watching. One evening, as Mark stood by the pond, the reflection of dozens of glowing gnomes surrounding him, he realized how far everything had come, from a simple hobby to a cultural phenomenon. But fame, he understood now, was a double-edged sword. It could protect him, but it could also consume him. As the lights flickered and the last visitors drifted away, he made a quiet vow to himself. He wouldn't let the HOA, or anyone else, destroy what he'd built. The Gnome Sanctuary wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a message, a reminder that ordinary people could stand their ground. And as news of a possible second wave of HOA action began circulating online, Mark knew the next battle was approaching. But this time, he was ready, and the world was watching. By the time autumn rolled around, the Gnome Sanctuary had become more than a story. It was a movement. Tour buses occasionally drove by, families still came to take pictures, and donations continued to pour in. But beneath the colorful lights and smiling faces, a quiet tension was growing. The HOA had regrouped, stronger, quieter, and more strategic than before. Gone were the days of open confrontation. Now they operated in the shadows, hiding behind layers of bureaucracy and legal jargon. Their new president, a smooth-talking man named Richard, presented himself as the face of restoration and unity. He spoke softly, smiled often, and insisted he wanted to find balance. But behind his polished image lay the same hunger for control that Carol once embodied. The first move was subtle. The HOA introduced a new community cleanliness ordinance that prohibited non-standard outdoor displays that may attract pests or disrupt harmony. It didn't mention gnomes by name, but everyone knew who the target was. Next came complaints about increased traffic, noise, levels, and littering. Mark received letters from the city, warning of possible fines for excessive gatherings. Though the accusations were vague, they created an atmosphere of pressure and suspicion. For the first time in months, Mark felt cornered again. He noticed unfamiliar cars parked near his street at odd hours. Sometimes they'd linger for minutes, their engines running before driving off. Neighbors whispered about HOA members recording visitors, collecting evidence. The board had learned its lesson. They wouldn't go after Mark directly. Instead, they'd go after everything around him. The road outside his home suddenly became a restricted parking zone. Permits were required, issued only to residents. The visitors, unable to park nearby, began to dwindle. Food trucks were banned for safety reasons. Volunteers who helped maintain the garden received warnings about unauthorized labor on residential property. Slowly, the crowds grew thinner. Mark watched the change with quiet frustration. He knew exactly what was happening. The HOA was bleeding the attraction dry, not through direct confrontation, but through slow, calculated suffocation. They wanted the garden to fade, to die quietly without a fight. But Mark wasn't ready to give up. He had faced worse before, and he had something now that the HOA couldn't take away: public support. He reached out to his growing online community, posting a detailed video update explaining the new wave of suppression. The response was overwhelming. Viewers flooded the city council with emails and calls. They shared the story again, reigniting the viral flame that had begun to dim. Within days, Dows or Save the Gnomes was trending nationwide. Journalists revisited the neighborhood. News vans returned. The HOA, which had hoped to act unnoticed, found itself once again in the spotlight. Richard, the new president, was forced to hold a press conference. He tried to maintain composure, claiming the HOA's actions were for safety and order, but the media saw through it. Cameras caught the nervous glances of board members, their vague answers only fueling more questions. Once again, the HOA looked like bullies. Yet even with public backlash, they didn't stop. Richard was smarter than Carol, more patient, more methodical. He began reaching out to individual residents privately, offering small favors in exchange for votes, promising reduced fees or leniency on minor violations if they supported new HOA reforms. Gradually, he rebuilt a loyal circle. Their goal was simple: rewrite the community bylaws completely, giving the HOA broader authority over aesthetic and public safety standards. If they succeeded, Mark's garden would officially become illegal. The vote was scheduled quietly, tucked into the end of a routine meeting. But Mark wasn't caught off guard. One of his allies, a neighbor who attended HOA sessions secretly, warned him in advance. Mark knew this was it. The second war had begun, and this time it would be fought on paper, not in gardens. He spent days preparing. He compiled records, media clippings, legal documents, and testimonials from hundreds of visitors. He coordinated with local lawyers who had followed his story since the beginning. When the day of the meeting came, the HOA expected a small turnout, just enough to push their new policies through unnoticed. But when they arrived at the clubhouse, they were met with cameras, reporters, and dozens of residents demanding transparency. Mark had called them all. He stood quietly at the back, watching as the board members fidgeted under the harsh light of public attention. The meeting began, and Richard tried to control the room, reading the proposal in his usual calm tone. But the moment he mentioned the clause about removal of unapproved displays, the room erupted. Residents shouted objections, journalists took notes, and even former HOA members spoke out, calling it what it was: an attempt to silence one man's freedom. Mark didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The crowd spoke for him. When the time came to vote, the result was overwhelming. The proposal failed. The HOA's power grab collapsed in real time, recorded by every camera in the room. The footage spread online overnight. Headlines read, "HOA defeated again. The Gnome Man wins." Richard tried to recover, insisting it had been a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. The board fractured, members resigned, and the HOA's credibility was shattered for the second time. For Mark, it was a victory, but it felt different from the first. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about principle, about proving that ordinary people could resist organized intimidation and win. That night, he walked through his garden in silence. The lights glowed softly, the gnomes smiling as always. The air was cool, the sound of distant laughter echoing faintly from the street. He thought about how far things had come, from a single gnome to a national movement. The HOA had tried everything: threats, fines, lawsuits, manipulation, and still, the gnomes stood. They had become a symbol of resilience, of standing your ground even when the odds were impossible. But deep down, Mark knew the battle wasn't truly over. Power never disappears. It just changes form. And though the HOA lay in ruins, whispers of another lawsuit began surfacing. Some residents, frustrated by the media chaos, wanted peace again, even if it meant siding with authority. The war might have been won, but the struggle for freedom would never end completely. Still, as the night deepened and the garden lights twinkled like stars, Mark smiled to himself. Whatever came next, he was ready. The gnomes had taught him something no HOA could ever understand, that sometimes defiance itself is the most beautiful form of harmony. Winter arrived with a cold wind that swept through the neighborhood like a warning. The once bustling gnome sanctuary now sat under a thin layer of frost, its cheerful colors muted by the gray sky. Fewer visitors came these days. The season had slowed everything down, yet beneath the surface something was brewing again. The HOA, though publicly defeated, had not disappeared. What remained of the organization had regrouped quietly, forming what they called a restoration committee. On paper, it sounded harmless, an effort to restore peace and order in the community after months of turmoil. But Mark knew better. Behind the polite words and measured tone, the same resentment lingered. The new committee was smaller, more secretive, and more cunning. They couldn't fight him in the open anymore, not with the world watching, and so they turned to stealth. Their plan was not to confront him directly, but to make life unbearable through endless technicalities. First came the anonymous complaints again, letters from concerned residents about noise, parking, and unsightly decorations. Then came surprise visits from code enforcement officers, responding to reports of unsafe structures and improper electrical wiring. Every inspection came up clean, but the constant harassment wore on him. Mark stayed calm, polite, collected, but he was tired. The gnome sanctuary had grown beyond his expectations, yet the fight never seemed to end. Each day brought a new obstacle, a new reminder that standing your ground came with a cost. Still, he refused to back down. The garden had become more than decoration. It was a story, a statement, a living piece of defiance that inspired people far beyond his street. He received letters from around the world, from people who had faced their own versions of the HOA, their own battles against petty authority. They told him how his story gave them courage. That, more than anything, kept him going. But the HOA's final move came when he least expected it. Late one evening, as snow began to fall, Mark found an envelope taped to his door. It wasn't from the HOA directly. It was from a law firm representing several concerned homeowners. They had filed a civil lawsuit against him, claiming the gnome sanctuary caused emotional distress, traffic congestion, and devaluation of property. It was the last desperate strike of an enemy that couldn't win by rules. The amount they demanded in damages was absurd, clearly meant to intimidate. For a moment, Mark felt the familiar sting of frustration. He could fight. He had the money, the supporters, the legal team, but he wondered if it was worth it anymore. The garden had already proven its point. Maybe it was time to let go. That night, he walked through the yard in silence. The lights shimmered faintly under the snow. The gnomes stood still, their smiles frozen in the cold, eternal and unbothered. They had survived everything: fines, lawsuits, ridicule, and threats. He realized then that no matter what the HOA did next, they could never erase what he'd created. The story was already written. The next morning, news broke that the lawsuit had leaked to the press. The public's reaction was immediate and furious. Reporters swarmed the story again, calling it the HOA's last pathetic attempt at control. The plaintiffs were bombarded with backlash. Sponsors pulled out, lawyers withdrew, and within a week, the case was dismissed. The HOA's final strike had failed before it even began. The neighborhood was done fighting. The endless tension, the embarrassment, and the exhaustion had worn everyone down. At the next community meeting, residents voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. The motion passed with near unanimity. Just like that, the institution that had ruled over them for decades ceased to exist. The relief was palpable. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. Truly free. People began decorating their lawns again, planting whatever flowers they wanted, painting fences bright colors. It wasn't chaos. It was liberation. Mark watched it all quietly, content to fade into the background. He didn't crave the spotlight or recognition. He just wanted peace. And for the first time, he had it. Months passed and the garden remained. Spring came again, melting the last of the snow, revealing fresh blooms and clean pathways. The gnomes looked brighter than ever, standing proudly as symbols of victory, resilience, and individuality. Visitors still came, though fewer than before, and that suited Mark just fine. One afternoon, as he tended to the flowers near the pond, he noticed something new. Someone, maybe a neighbor, maybe a stranger, had left a small gnome at the edge of the garden. It was simple, unpainted, and plain. Attached to it was a small note that read, "For standing tall when others bowed." Mark smiled. It was a quiet, perfect ending. The war was over, but its message would live on, not just in his yard, but in every person who had followed his story, who had found courage in his calm defiance. The HOA had tried to bury him under fines, fear, and bureaucracy, but all they had done was plant the seeds of something far more powerful. The gnomes had won, not through violence or greed, but through patience and persistence. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the countless tiny faces in his garden, Mark stood back and took it all in. The laughter of children in the distance, the rustle of leaves, the soft hum of life returning to peace. What began as a small act of rebellion had become a legend, one that would be told and retold long after the last HOA letter had turned to dust. And so, surrounded by his army of smiling gnomes, Mark finally allowed himself to rest. The fight was over, and in the silence that followed, victory never looked so peaceful.